Angus Cummings is a PhD student at Montana State University, my alma mater, so excited for this one. He was raised in Northern California, and he received a BS and a BA degree from the University of Vermont. Since that time, he has worked for conservation nonprofits in Hawaii, Wyoming, Montana, and Oregon. And those experiences drove him to study the history of conservation. Angus is researching a dissertation on the history of the American prairie and bison restoration efforts. And he is also a graduate research assistant at MSU's Center for Science, Technology, Ethics, and Society. Angus is interested in research that moves outside of the archives by relying on oral histories, interviews, and community engagement. So please welcome Angus.
Well, I'm going to be talking about the Buffalo Commons, and I know it's a personal story for a lot of people. So I thought that I would start by sharing how I've come to this story and my own background. In 2019, my family and my 200 distant relatives, we collectively each had a share in a lumber company that our relatives started in 1895. And we decided to sell the company because nobody in our family wanted to take it over. And I think, and slowly our family had become moving further and further away from working in lumber and mills, and we had kind of lost track of where and how we were attached to the landscapes in Illinois, where my grandparents still live. And I think somebody who's benefited from lumber industry and clear cutting of forests, I've always felt torn between conservation, protecting landscapes, which I feel like I owe back for all the benefits that I've received from the removal of forests across this nation. At the same time, I feel very attached to working the land and all of these, whether that is, I mean, for me, it was lumber industry, but for a lot of people, it's ranching or farming and all these other kinds of attachments to landscapes and how we find place and how we identify family. And I just wanted to start by centering myself in this story because I know it's important to a lot of people. All right, so Prairie Prophets, Deborah and Frank Popper and the legacy of the Buffalo Commons. All right, let's see how this clicker's working. Great. In 1987, Frank and Deborah Popper wrote an article called The Great Plains from Dust to Dust. In this article, they claimed that because of difficult environmental conditions in the Great Plains, such as droughts, fires, hot summers, cold winters, I mean, you name it, that the Great Plains was untenable for long-term settlement, and that combined with economic turnover, financial depressions, and all of these factors had created three major boom-bust cycles, and that they foresaw another boom-bust cycle coming. And instead of continuing in the settlement of this area, they proposed the creation of the Buffalo Commons. Now, the Buffalo Commons was an idea that the federal government would step in throughout the Great Plains region and buy up private ranches and farms and transform that space collectively into the largest national park in human history. And that another aspect of this would be the returning of Sioux land in the Black Hills, according to the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty, which was a court case that is still ongoing and had then just been reintroduced in 1887. But a big part of this was the emphasis on taking down fences, replanting native grasses, and bringing back native fauna such as bison. And now I'm going to talk about how I've come to this project and what I think the significance of the Buffalo Commons is today. So I started working with Buffalo like 5 or 6 years ago. And I had come across the Buffalo Commons idea, and I reached out to Frank and Deborah Popper for a paper I was writing for one of my classes. And they got back to me, and I then embarked on emailing them, talking to them, and we started a year-long oral history project, which will be available as soon as I get those transcriptions done at MSU. But just you guys wait. Give me another 3 or 4 years. We'll see. And then I carried on, I've read all their articles, and I've gone through regional newspapers and seen what people have said about them. And I've been wrestling with why the Buffalo Commons matter so much. And since I'm coming from a conservation background, I've decided that what they've done is they've really predicted a lot of important directions that the conservation movement is moving in and has moved in, such as a focus on large landscape conservation, regional analysis, grasslands, which nobody was paying attention to for about a century, bison reintroduction, and most importantly, indigenous leadership. So that's going to be how I'm going to move forward with talking about the Buffalo Commons. But first, we should probably talk about what was going on in the grasslands. So here's a great map looking at how since 1880, the amount of grassland has slowly been decreasing. And as you can see, by the turn of the 21st century, much of the grasslands has disappeared. And grasslands are one of the most imperiled bioregions in the world. Yet, the Northern Great Plains has been targeted by conservation groups and understood to be one of the few places where full grassland reintroduction would be possible. There has been throughout the 20th century, there were some grassland preservation efforts, mostly the creation of the National Grasslands in 1960. But those are these little black dots. You can see there's not a lot of coverage there. So by the time the Poppers are writing about the grasslands, much of native grass had disappeared, as well as the flora and fauna, or the fauna that existed there. So moving into this, where was conservation when the Poppers started, is a great place to start to understand their significance. In the 1970s, an idea of bioregionalism came up. Previously, a lot of conservation efforts, a lot of generally spatial analysis had happened according to legal, political frameworks of understanding space. And then this idea of bioregionalism comes out in the 1970s. So people are starting to say, hold on, this isn't working for how we actually interact with space. Instead, let's look at how a shared ecology unites an area. And a big part of that was moving away from globalism and looking towards localism and seeing what are the actual environmental limitations within a space that, and how do you live within harmony of a space that you're not destroying it. Part of the 1970s environmentalist movement. But a great example would be the creation of the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem in 1970s. And I'm actually screenshotting my cursor, so I forgot to delete that. But a great example would be how people started thinking about Yellowstone. They started looking at conservation not just as protecting the park itself, but the surrounding areas, understanding that species don't just live within our political boundaries. And this definitely influenced how the Poppers thought about the Great Plains. They weren't just thinking about preserving small pieces of it. Obviously, they proposed, well, preserving the entire thing, which is crazy in hindsight, but certainly got people to think about it. Another big shift was the creation of large landscape conservation. The idea of biogeography was coined in 1960s by some famous ecologists. I'm not going to name drop because I don't have any pictures of them, and they'll make people lost. But point being is that he realized that the more isolated a space was, the fewer species it could hold because they couldn't migrate between different spaces. And then the same E.O. Wilson in 1980, I said I wouldn't name drop, but I guess I am. He came up with this idea of biodiversity, and he said the healthier ecosystems are one that have the greatest diversity of species within a space, as well as the greatest diversity of genetics within a species. And those two ideas together kind of were what ended up happening is people realized to have the greatest biodiversity, what we need is to have the largest spaces so that populations aren't isolated and they can retain the greatest resilience and health. So by the 1980s, people were thinking of conservation, of corridors, of connections, of how do we create large spaces that animals can move between. Another big influence was the Big Open. Bob Scott and Douglas Kaufman created this idea of rewilding the wildlands ecosystem in central Montana called the Big Open. This predated the Buffalo Commons' after we hosted the Poppers last spring, Bob Scott wrote an op-ed article and very kindly reminded me that I had forgotten to remember the Big Open. And so I'm doing my due diligence here. The Big Open was an idea to pretty much create what the Buffalo Commons is on a much smaller scale. Unfortunately, they approached it with this idea that we don't want to ruffle any tail feathers, and we kind of want to secretly build up this space. But what ended up happening is that everybody found out about it and nobody knew anything about it. They just heard rumors. So everybody was kind of scared of this Big Open and had no idea what was going on. So it kind of faded into the background and was incredibly disliked, which the Buffalo Commons obviously also fell into that mold, but that's later on. Another big part of the rise of the Buffalo Commons is the Native American sovereignty movement. 60s and 70s, you have AIM, different tribal coalitions, and specific tribes all carrying, or not all, but many of them carrying out sovereignty movements and recognition of treaty rights. And this created a greater national awareness of indigenous rights, indigenous movements and treaties, and a group that allied, some groups that allied were out of the counterculture, environmentalist, New Age movement, and they adopted or more often appropriated indigenous knowledge or indigenous issues. And while those were problematic alliances often, they did kind of plant seeds for future indigenous and nonprofit and government coalitions that are such a big part of the conservation movement today. Okay. So another big aspect of what was going on in the Great Plains before the Buffalo Commons arose is the farm crisis. We have economic hardship and population decline really starting to grow in the late 70s and early 80s with, I'm not going to go through all the processes because this is actually as complicated as my understanding of farm economics in the Great Plains during the farm crisis gets. But overall, we saw these communities shrinking and going through a very difficult economic time. And you had greater national visibility of the region, especially among coastal elites who are starting to think about, all right, how do we help this area? How do we intervene? Which is obviously problematic. So you started having all these ideas about trying to assist this part of our country. The Poppers, on the other hand, they intervened at this time, but their intervention had nothing to do with the farm crisis as much as they were working on a pet theory about that the frontier never disappeared from the West and that it just moved location. And they were looking at two spaces. One was the Great Plains and one was the Pacific Northwest that they'd write a paper about and try to argue their case. And they chose the Great Plains because it was closer to New York City. Which is kind of problematic, but it did end up making for an interesting paper at least. So now we're going to get to the Poppers. All right, this is Frank and Deborah Popper. In 1887, Frank was a professor. They had 2 kids together. They'd been married for a long time. Deborah was just finishing her doctorate degree. She was a geographer. And I'm convinced that part of the Popper's success was so many of the things that people in the Great Plains didn't like and so many of the things that, so many of the perspectives they brought to the table. One was that they perfectly fit this mold of these East Coast outsider elites who were naive, didn't know anything about the region, and that made their story spread like wildfire because they so easily fit into these historical narrative that has been on repeat throughout the Great Plains for such a long time. Another important aspect of how the Great Plains the Buffalo Commons came to be is that the Poppers are first-generation Americans. Both of their parents escaped the Holocaust. And Frank grew up in Chicago and Deborah grew up in New York. But they grew up with these ideas of Americana, of Indians and cowboys and buffalo that really, those visions of what the West was never left. They hadn't spent a lot of time. Frank would tell you he went on a college road trip with his friends across the Great Plains, and that was his awakening moment to the Great Plains. And I'm going to go ahead and say that every time I've driven across the Great Plains, it's never made me make a plan for the entire region. But It did it these ideas of what the West was did highly influence the Buffalo Commons, this idea of bringing back bison. Another important part is their field of study. They are a geographer and urban planner. They were spatial and quantitative thinkers. So they looked at this space, they looked at the Great Plains, they reduced it down to 5 indicators of distress. They said, are banks closing? What are the construction rates? They looked at different ways of measuring growth within the region. And that's how they approached this. And that's how they came to the conclusion that the Great Plains was shrinking. And of course, we know that that's incredibly reductive and doesn't actually build the relations with the people who actually live there, which became a big part of the adaptation of the Buffalo Commons over time. But that really influenced the creation of the idea itself. Another big aspect of this is that Frank and Deborah spent 10, 12 years touring the Great Plains after they published this paper. They did over 60 different conference circuits. They spent an immense amount of time after they wrote this actually getting to know people there. And a big part of this was Frank hated academia. He hated being a professor. He did not like all the rigmarole, all of the tenure decisions and all that kind of stuff. And Deborah was just starting her academic career. So she was kind of just figuring out what this all looked like. So together, they went around and they were so excited to go and engage with public in different communities. And the final aspect is one thing they really hammered down, and I think is actually really sweet, is that they're a couple. So they would go to these different communities. They didn't know anybody. And honestly, they were hated. And but they would say, oh, wow, I'm having an off day. Maybe Deborah can take this one. Or this guy's really tearing me apart. Maybe somebody can come with maybe Frank can come up and say something. So they really got to lean on each other, which I think is pretty sweet. All right, so let's talk about the Poppers' visits to Montana. They had 2 visits to Montana in 1991, the first of which was to Rocky Mountain College in Billings. Frank and Deborah, Frank tells a story, and I'm going to tell these stories the way they told them to me. And I'm sure there's different opinions about how this went down. But Frank and Deborah in Rocky Mountain College, they were approached by somebody who started accusing Frank of working for the Trilateral Commission with this plan to take over the Great Plains, depopulate it, and this world takeover, world order vision. And that was kind of Frank's experience with his visit in Billings. And of course, that reflected one of the major responses of people throughout the region, which was, who are you working for, and why are you here, and why are you saying all these things, and why are you in my business? And while maybe the Trilateral Commission was an extreme attachment, what it did emphasize is that people really did think Frank and Deborah had power to change things. And the reality was they had zero power. They had almost no money. They had they had nobody backing them. They were literally just brought to start conversations. Another interesting visit in 1991 later on was to Lewistown. Bob Scott, who started the Big Open, invited Frank and Deborah to come and join them for a talk. And the town of Lewistown held strikes and rallies against their visit. And these were actually aimed at Bob Scott, who has not been very popular within the region because his idea of the Big Open swallowed up part of Lewistown. And the community threatened the hotel to release bison in the hotel to shut down the conference, which was really effective because then the hotel called Frank and Bob and were like, hey, if you guys want to have this hotel, you're gonna have to get security guards. And Frank and Deborah were like, all right, this isn't worth it. We get your point, we're not coming. So Bob Scott and Frank canceled it, but later, as Frank tells the story, he got a call and got re-invited back in, but they left him 50 miles out of town to figure out how to get there. I don't know if that part's true, but it makes for a good story. So I wanted to talk more about what other communities' responses are, because they travel throughout the entirety of the Great Plains. One of the big ones was kind of this gritty, we can do this attitude that had allowed settlers within the Great Plains to continue to ranch, continue to work farms when they were opposed by, anything from locust swarms to blizzards throughout from 1880. So there's kind of this argument that we've always pulled ourselves up by our bootstraps, we'll do it again. Another argument was, especially during the 70s, in the Great Plains had been a major producer of agricultural exports as part of our Cold War strategy. And this argument of we feed the world. People in the Great Plains were rightfully very frustrated that the paupers were coming in saying, you guys would be better off if this was a buffalo region, when they were arguing, well, what are you going to eat? Another prominent response were, who are these idiots? They actually don't understand anything about what's going on here. They're incredibly naive. And that was pretty accurate from the start of the Buffalo Commons idea. But over time, as we'll get to, the idea became more tempered as the paupers got a better idea of how things in the region actually worked. Something that Deborah would often talk about is when the paupers are often invited to communities, not because the communities were interested in bringing back buffalo as much as they were interested in having a common enemy that everybody could hate. You could get ranchers, wheat farmers, and oilmen in Oklahoma all sitting at the same table for the first time because they could all disagree that what they didn't want was to be part of the world's largest national park. So that was a really powerful moment that was a really powerful unifier for communities. And finally, Deborah and Frank often talk about people coming up after their presentations and saying, I'm so glad you've brought this up. I didn't want my neighbors to hate me for saying maybe this agricultural plan that we've been doing isn't quite working. So that was a little bit of a long-winded slide. And all right, so I want to revisit where the Buffalo Commons is today. So there's some things they really got wrong. First of all, the federal government obviously first of all, we don't have the Buffalo Commons. The region-wide, I mean, we're not sitting in a prairie right now surrounded by buffalo. But the federal government also never stepped in and bought private land, and they never bought ranches and never bought farms on the scale that was envisioned. Secondly, the paupers talk about how when they were writing this paper in their 30s, 40s, they thought a generation was a really long time. And now, talking to them in their 80s, recording the interview, what they emphasize is they realize a generation is not a long time, and things don't change that much in a generation always. And so they were wrong about how the speed in which they envisioned the Buffalo Commons would come to be. What they did get right is that bison conservation is growing. It is growing at a tremendous rate. Grasslands have become a recognized priority, not just within the northern Great Plains or the southern Great Plains, but worldwide, the grasslands have been recognized for their importance for conservation. And finally, populations are continuing to decline in the Great Plains. And that was an accurate prediction, although it's not anything like what they imagined it might be. So in 2006, they restated their Buffalo Commons idea and what it meant to them. And as you can see, it was really tempered down. They said, we envision more native grasses, more bison, less cattle, less farming, and more environmental protection. So they really tampered it down from this all or nothing to kind of a middle ground, which in some ways has definitely come to be. So now I want to talk about what they predicted right about the Buffalo Commons. And Frank loved to end his talks with this line, 5 streams struggling to be born. Deborah hated this. Every time he brought it up in the oral histories, Deborah would lose her mind. It was great to be a third party to this conversation. But the idea of this was that he saw that there would be 5 groups that would be pushing the bison restoration forward. And he nailed it. He saw tribes as being one of the main leaders. Tribes now have more than 20,000 bison. The ITBC has done a phenomenal job organizing that process for many tribes, although we'll get to that later. The federal government has had 30,000 bison for like 3 decades. They've been static. So that one, we're going to give them like a medium, not quite a check mark, but close. NGOs, though, have been increasing their herds tremendously. They're now up to, I think, maybe 20,000 bison. And then Ted Turner now is 45,000 bison, almost 50,000. And then private ranchers are the largest owners of bison within the United States. They have almost 500,000 bison collectively together. And those are the 5 groups that the paupers recognized as being the 5 streams. And then I didn't do the breakdown in Canada, but I thought these numbers were cool, so I added Canada to give us the total for North America. And then there's bison in Europe and Asia, but I'm not counting those because I don't know. I'm not finding those statistics too. So one of the biggest impacts I found, or I think the Buffalo Commons had, is that Buffalo Commons was one of the first environmental conversations that really split into do you support a specific animal or do you support the people who live there? It was one of those conversations that ended up boiling down to, are you for ranchers or are you for bison? Are you for farmers or are you for bison? And this was a division that that started becoming the dialogue throughout the 80s and the 90s, especially with the lumber versus the spotted owl conversation, and is now a huge part of the conversation for American Prairie. Are you for cowboys or are you for buffalo? This is a way of boiling down into a dichotomy, which is tugging on the heartstrings of people both ways, and really is oversimplifying an incredibly complex issue. And but it's how we've come to think about, I mean, pretty much all aspects of American society, and these, as we all know, with an election cycle coming up. So another big transformation that the paupers predicted is looking right after the paupers published their paper, in the 1990s, this idea of biodiversity hotspots came up. All right, I think I know how to use the pointer. Okay, here's the pointer. So you can see all these red spaces are biodiversity hotspots, and they're areas of the world that have been selected for having the highest degree and the most biodiversity. And for the most part, they're collectively in around the equator, or like 30 degrees off from the equator. But the issue with this kind of conservation is that you have money pouring in from the United States going into countries who are maybe, it's pretty much transporting the Buffalo Commons issue into other countries, but making it more complicated because you have US nonprofits reaching out and trying to create conserved spaces and removing indigenous and local people from that area. So a huge equity issue, and it also created a problem because you might be protecting species that have or areas with high biodiversity, but you weren't getting grasslands, you weren't getting tundra species, you weren't getting the breadth of species. So in 2000s, a new approach comes out, which is eco-regionalism, and it's looking at it's breaking up the globe into different specific regions that represent different types of biodiversity. And this has been kind of the more prominent type of conservation now, where we select different representative parts. So we'll choose northern grasslands is a great example. So now we've protected a grassland area. So you choose different pieces. And that was something the paupers predicted. They chose a space that recognizably was not well known for being incredibly biodiverse grasslands, but one that was significant because it held species that weren't seen elsewhere. And a great example of another group doing this work would be American Prairie. American Prairie is, I mean, great depending on where you stand on that issue, and that's a whole other presentation for later, and come see my dissertation. But American Prairie is, as we all know, is working in eastern Montana to preserve 3.2 million acres. They just purchased another 12,000 acres, and now up to 475,000 acres of conserved land. And the American Prairies inherited a lot of the Buffalo Commons kind of their baggage. Sean Garrity, the founder of American Prairie, I met with him a little while ago and talked with him, and he made it pretty clear that they are not associating with the Buffalo Commons because the Buffalo Commons is still such a touchy subject for so many people. But it's pretty clear where the idea of the American Prairie comes from restoring a large landscape with bison. So it's interesting to see the legacy of the Buffalo Commons carried on in the American Prairie. Another big conservation shift that the Buffalo Commons really predicted was the rise of indigenous conservation or in bison restoration. So we've seen now there's 20,000 bison the ITBC helps support. but there's also additional private herds owned by individual tribes. This number of bison is only increasing, especially, I mean, the new Yellowstone bison management plan just shifted over an extra couple thousand of bison from the culling process to repatriation efforts. And this is just part of a general trend of the federal government and NGO actors showing greater support as for buffalo repatriation to tribes. All right, last slide. Lasting significance of the Buffalo Commons. First of all, the large impacts of the Buffalo Commons is this polarization between bison and ranchers. This is something that most people take for granted now, and understanding that if you're for bison restoration in Montana, you're probably anti-cattle. You think cattle ranching is bad for the grasslands, or if you're vice versa. And that polarization wasn't as pronounced before the Buffalo Commons because nobody thought that buffalo were going to come back and were actually a threat to cattle ranching. So this was a large impact, is the shifting and the realization of these two, this dichotomization of bison and cattle ranching. Greater grassland conservation. So the Buffalo Commons drew a lot of national eyes and money and finances and support towards the Great Plains region. And since then, we have seen nonprofit works, Nature Conservancy, I mean, Great Plains Coalition, Grasslands Coalition. There's so many nonprofit groups working towards grasslands conservation. And the large part of that is because national attention was finally brought towards the region, and the Buffalo Commons is a big part of that. Another aspect of this is the Buffalo Commons is a concept. Now, the Poppers reworked the Buffalo Commons idea a couple times after they met with communities. And one of their ideas was that the Buffalo Commons isn't actually a plan to transform the region, but is instead a metaphor for an alternative land use. They said the Buffalo Commons isn't just about bringing back buffalo. It's about how do we live within a space according to its limits, and find alternatives to agriculture where you don't have an aquifer to support it, or ranching where it's overgrazed. And the idea of a Buffalo Commons was adopted by a bunch of communities. I mean, McCook, Nebraska has still, since 1992, has a Buffalo Commons storytelling festival where people tell the story of the founding of the town and celebrate their culture as kind of a, maybe it's a middle finger to the Buffalo Commons, or maybe it's celebrating an alternative way of understanding the space. There's bands, there's breweries, the Buffalo Commons has become part of the cultural identity of the Great Plains region, whether that's adoption, acceptance, or rebuttal. And then I made the argument that they made accurate predictions for the transformations in the conservation movement in the Great Plains. And I think, so some examples of that are buffalo numbers are increasing. There's fewer people living in the Great Plains. Grassland conservation has become a greater priority. And even while grasslands are continuing to be the world's most imperiled biome. And we're still seeing the rise of bison repatriation and grassland restoration, but it's also become a tool for building relations with tribes, where nonprofits and governments can work towards a common vision of 5 minutes, all right, of environmental protection with by restoring bison and working towards a common goal within the space. That's kind of what I got for you.